How many of us have read the book, Dan Brown's novel, Da Vinci Code? Anyone here? Having sold some 50 million copies, Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code is one of the biggest bestsellers of all time. The Da Vinci Code basically claims that Jesus of Nazareth was a mere mortal man who was who did not who gained his deity in the Council of Nicaea in AD 325 by a relatively close vote of the church leaders. The Da Vinci Code also claims that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene and the couple had a child, and that Jesus died a normal, natural death and was never raised again. While the book was of the historical fiction genre, what makes the Da Vinci Code especially deceptive is the fact that he claims on the very first page that all descriptions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in this novel are accurate. To be blunt, this claim is outrageously false. The book is riddled with errors, not just biblical and theological, but also artistic and historical ones. If the work was really intended to be, a fictional one, then why does the author bring in this statement in the beginning? So we can only conclude that this book's deceptions are deliberate. Now, for over 2000 years, Christians have insisted that Jesus rose physically from the dead on the Sunday after his crucifixion. The historicity of the resurrection of Christ is central to Christian theology because Jesus' death and resurrection are both tied to our salvation. While most religions teach that it is our good deeds that bring salvation to us, but Christianity teaches us that we are saved on the basis of what Jesus did for us. The Bible insists that while we were still far away from God, ignoring Him, rejecting Him, and rebelling against Him, God drew near to us in Christ to bear our sin, to take our punishment, and to die on that cross in our place. The resurrection is God's confirmation that Jesus was the one who claimed to be. And it is God's assurance to Christians that they have been forgiven. But what evidence do we have for this event? How can we be sure that it happened? How can we counter books like the Da Vinci Code with conviction? Every now and then we have claims like the Da Vinci Code that rises to challenge the resurrection. Therefore, it is very important for us to each year revisit the resurrection experience and examine the evidences that validate the resurrection of Christ so that we can stand firm and strong against such attacks. Of all the evidences that are there, the one that stands up most prominently is the empty tomb. First, let us consider that on that glorious Sunday morning, the tomb where Jesus was laid was found empty by Mary Magdalene and the other woman. The empty tomb stands as a silent witness to the miraculous event that took place. The empty tomb is one of the most puzzling parts of the story to all those who are not certain about what to believe regarding Jesus' resurrection. The first question would be, did Jesus really die? There's a hypothesis which attempts to explain away the resurrection, which is called the apparent death hypothesis or the swoon theory. This view says that Jesus was not completely dead and he was removed from the cross and was put in the tomb. And once inside the tomb, Jesus revived again and he escaped. And this is the basis of why the disciples believe that he arose from it. Now, this view is difficult to hold because of certain reasons. First of all, it is unlikely that a half dead man would be capable of even getting up to walk, much less move the huge stone that covered his tomb. It is said that it was almost the weight of the stone would be almost 2 tons that covered his tomb. And then there were guards outside. So you would have to open the tomb, overcome the guards who were standing guard, and then running away. For a half dead man, this would not be possible. Secondly, the Romans who had perfected the art of execution, they would make sure that the person they buried would be dead. They had the expertise to know whether he was just unconscious or whether he had died. They would not take down the body from the cross till they were sure that he died. And thirdly, the physical torture that is described in the gospel accounts, it is highly unlikely that somebody would survive. I mean, the crucifixion was secondary. The flogging and all itself would kill most people. And then after that, he was crucified and then taken. So the fact that he died is not something that we can dispute. Now, the second question that could come is, did they put Jesus' body in the grave at all, in the cave? The tomb that was selected was owned by a prominent Jewish leader. So it is unlikely that his plot would be some obscure place. Everybody would know where the tomb is. Now, if the disciples were planning to make up a story about his resurrection, they would have chosen a tomb which was obscure. They would not have chosen a tomb which everybody knew about. Anybody in Jerusalem could, go to the tomb and verify, because everybody knew where the tomb was. So anybody could go and verify whether the tomb was really empty or whether the body was still there. In fact, Jesus' disciples started talking about the resurrection just a few days after it happened. So, but we don't have any records where somebody, somebody disproved what the disciples said. Anybody would have gone, and if the disciples were saying Jesus risen again, they could have gone to the tomb and prove that they were telling a lie. But nobody could do that, because that is because it was true that there was no body. Also, we could also, because the tomb, again, as per the record, the tomb was sealed. No, not only that, there were guards stationed outside the tomb. If there was no body inside the tomb, why would the tomb be sealed and the guards be appointed? But the most convincing argument for the empty tomb was the fact that came from the Roman officials and the high-ranking Jewish officials. Immediately after the resurrection, they accused Jesus' followers of stealing the body and going on, and stealing the body and removing it from the tomb. Now, by making such an accusation, they were accepting, number one, the fact that the body was there. Number two, that the body is no longer there. Now, disciples could not have. We remember that all the disciples ran away when Jesus was crucified. So I'm sure they would not gather the courage to come back, fight the guards who were outside, and removing the seal itself was a crime. They would be punished with death. But but the seal was removed, the stone was removed, and the body was no longer there. Now the fact that the Roman officials and the Jewish officials making such a accusation against the disciples itself goes on to prove that Jesus rose from the dead. It was because the Roman soldiers, if something like that had happened, the Roman soldiers would have been executed. They would have been punished. I'm sure and these Roman soldiers had seen war, and they were the best fighting force in the world at that point of time. A few fishermen could not go and overpower them, remove the bell. Now, apart from the second evidence that we can look at is the written records that we have regarding the resurrection. It was recorded by 4 independent authors, with each gospel account accurately pointing out several small details regarding the resurrection. Each of the 4 authors give an account of resurrection of Jesus, and going through the accounts, we can conclude safely that they were not made up in collusion, that they did not come together, sit and decide, no, we will make up a story like this. Because if they had colluded, if they had decided to plan and write the same story or tell the same story, then each of those stories would be perfectly same. There would not be any differences. But when we go through all the 4 authors, what they have recorded, there are minor differences in each of their stories. Like the number of angels, the number of people that visited the tomb, the time of arrival, and other such small details, which were different in each of this. But each of them told the story in more or less similar ways. I mean, the main aspects of the story did not change among the 4 of them. So, but like I said, if they had decided, planned, and wrote, they would have written the same story. Everyone would have, right to the last comma, full stop would have been the same, but it is not. It was independent stories that each one of them, what they recollected or what they experienced there. Now, if 4 of them decide to write their own stories, imagine if they were writing separately, then remember that the story was largely similar. Many of the small details were similar. So if they had, independently made up their minds to write, then many of these largely similar points would not have come. So they were all actually writing up something that they had seen, they had experienced. Therefore, it is safe to conclude that all 4 were true. Now, thirdly, we have the eyewitness accounts. The Bible records that the first people to see Jesus risen from the dead were women. The fact that the followers of Christ claimed that the first witness to the living Jesus, where woman is perhaps surprisingly the best evidence that the account is true. Because in those days, in Jewish culture, the testimony of a woman was not highly esteemed. If the disciples had made up the story and wanted to present a believable and convincing argument, they would have said that the first person to witness Jesus was a man, and not just any man, some prominent man. They would have for sure uh, put the name of a prominent man to make it more convincing. But the fact that the Gospels say that a group of women were first to see Jesus alive strongly suggests that the story is true. Why else would those claiming Jesus rose from the dead appeal to witnesses unlikely to be believed, except that they really were the first ones to see? And these women were not the only ones who saw. Following his resurrection, Jesus appeared not only to Mary Magdalene but also to his disciples. They claim to have seen him not only once or for a short time, but for an extended period of several weeks. And it is not that they saw visions. They claim that they touched him, they talked to him, they ate with him. And these experiences were not limited to one or two people. Jesus appeared to quite a number of people. In fact, including one time where 500 people saw him, as it is documented by Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:6. These were not hallucinations or wishful thinking, but tangible encounters with the risen Christ. The sincerity and convictions of these eyewitness testimonials further affirm the reality of resurrection. Now, the fourth evidence is the transformation of the disciples. It is nearly universally accepted by historians that the disciples genuinely believed that they had encountered a risen Christ. The reason for this consensus is that the persecution that the apostles endured in their belief of resurrection. The apostles were repeatedly beaten and imprisoned. We have good historical evidence that Paul, Peter, and James were executed for their faith. And church tradition maintains that as many as 11 of the 12 disciples were eventually martyred. These were the same people who few days back, ran away in fear, who were confused, who did not know what to do. Yet after encountering the risen Christ, they were emboldened to proclaim the gospel with unwavering conviction, even in the face of persecution and martyrdom. Now if somebody tells us to jump off this first floor, I won't, but maybe some of us would have the courage to jump. From the fourth floor, I'm sure nobody would jump. 10th floor, not even. Now, there is a sport called bungee jump. Yeah, we would jump if there's a cushion below. There's a sport called bungee jumping, which is an activity where people jump from great heights, from cliffs or on top of bridges, and they jump down. They jump down with a elastic cord connected to them, so that they don't fall and crash. Even that would require a certain amount of courage, I guess. But still, because that cord is there, they jump. Without the cord, it is certain that they would not jump. Similarly, for the disciples, when they were faced with death. They knew that if they proclaimed Jesus, they would be killed. There was so much of opposition. It would have been easy to accept what the establishment wanted them to speak. If they said just discounted Jesus's resurrection, they would have been safe. 11 people, all these people would not have died. But they chose death because for them, their faith, their experience, and their because they knew that Jesus had risen, and the faith that they too would rise up one day was the elastic rope which gave them the courage to jump into it. Another evidence would be the conversion of Paul. Because the conversion of Paul was different. I mean, it was not the disciples, they knew Jesus. They were with him throughout. Even if they were afraid after some time, they came back. Now, Paul was different. It is Paul's conversion is a very important incident that happened and which is recorded in the book of Acts. Paul was originally a great opponent of the church. And he even consented to the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Now, the same Paul, who was Saul at that point of time, while traveling to Damascus, suddenly became a Christian. Paul, who was on his way to Damascus to continue his persecution, he had letters from the Pharisees, the leaders in Jerusalem, authorizing him to hunt for Christians. The same guy on his way claims that he encountered the risen Christ and becomes a Christian. This is very powerful because unlike other apostles, Paul was not a follower of Jesus Christ during his ministry, and he was not a friend to the early church. His conversion or his testimony would be what we could call a hostile witness. Someone who had no incentive to accept the Christian testimony about resurrection unless he himself had encountered Christ, or he was convinced enough convinced enough about the fact that Jesus had risen. Now, the weight of this piece of evidence is significant because first, Paul's conversion put him at odds with the Jewish religious leaders in every city that he visited. Because he was talking about resurrection, he was every Jewish leaders wanted to persecute him. In Corinthians, Paul recounts how he was whipped, beaten, stoned, and shipwrecked as a result of his faith. Moreover, the physical consequences of his conversion was perhaps less than the spiritual implications, because like many Pharisees, Paul regarded the claims of Jesus' followers regarding his resurrection, regarding the fact that Jesus was the Messiah, that was blasphemous for him. Paul was an upright Pharisee, a very good Jew, a Jew of Jews. And for him, the fact that Jesus was a Messiah would, accepting that would create, it would be contradictory to his belief. But Paul underwent a complete transformation in a matter of days. All the years of training, his practice of Jewish religion was just overturned in a matter of a few days. Now, this does not happen just like that. He changed from saying that, believing that Jesus was a false prophet, to the fact that Jesus was the unique Son of God. That was, a remarkable change, which could happen only if it was true and only if he had really uh, encountered the result. Just like uh, Paul, there's one more person who had a remarkable conversion, and that was no other than James, the brother of Jesus. James was Jesus' half brother, and like Paul, or rather Saul, James did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. In fact, John 7:5 and Mark 3:21 record this fact. But fast forward a few years later, we find that something has changed, and James has become a strong believer of Jesus. James obviously experienced some kind of radical transformation in his attitude to Jesus. What caused this transformation? 1 Corinthians 15:7 tells us that Jesus appeared to James after his resurrection. And this encounter had a profound effect on James. This is confirmed by the fact that several historical documents outside the Bible mention that James, not just a leader of the church, but he willingly gave up his life for Jesus. Historical documents by Josephus and Clement of Alexandria tells us that James was killed by being thrown down from the pinnacle of the temple, and then he was stoned and clubbed until death. So, for someone who was a skeptic to finally die for Jesus means that he also had a real transformation, and that transformation could come around only because he encountered Christ. Furthermore, we have the growth of the early church. Once again, we should remember that the church gave birth in a time when it was not favorable. Everyone was against it. The Roman establishment was against it. The Jewish leaders were against it. Yet, against all these odds, the fledgling Christian movement spread like wildfire through the Roman Empire, despite intense opposition and persecution. What fueled this remarkable expansion? It was the fervent belief in the resurrected Christ. A belief so strong that it inspired countless men and women to forsake their old ways of life and old beliefs and embrace a new life. The growth of the early church stands as a testament to the enduring impact of the resurrection. Lastly, we have an ongoing presence of Christ in the lives of the believers. The resurrection is not merely a historical event confined to the annals of history, but it is a real reality that continues to shape lives of believers even today. Countless testimonies abound about lives being transformed, chains being broken, and hope being restored through a personal encounter with Christ. We have heard of so many testimonies all around. We have read, and maybe we have even encountered people whose life has changed because of their encounter with Christ. The presence of Christ in our midst is perhaps the most compelling evidence of it. In conclusion, the resurrection of Christ stands out as a cornerstone of our faith and is supported by a wealth of compelling evidence, from the empty tomb to the eyewitness accounts, from the transformation of the disciples to the growth of the early church. and from the ongoing presence of Christ to countless lives being transformed. The evidence of the resurrection is both abundant and undeniable. If Jesus is indeed resurrected and changed and has changed the lives of so many followers, may we too become greatly aware that the Lord is risen, and may we become aware this the of this that the resurrected Lord dwells in us, each one of us, by His Spirit. May our lives also be changed, and let us hold fast to the truth and proclaim it boldly to the world. For in resurrection we find hope, redemption, and eternity.